All right. So welcome and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you just joining, my name is Dan Seaman, and I'm a Regional Technical Assistance Coordinator with the Wisconsin RTI Center. And I am quite excited that most of you are able to join us this afternoon. We are going to be getting started very shortly. Actually, we are going to get started. So along with me, we have Jared Shaffner from Onalaska High School. He's the principal, and also at the center I do have Heidi Erstad. She is another Regional Technical Assistance Coordinator, and she will be helping me with the running of the webinar. And so we will go ahead and get started. As I mentioned earlier, to those of you who are sitting in waiting, we are running this webinar as a listen-in session. So your microphones have been muted. Given the number of people that had registered, we needed to make sure that we would eliminate any echoing or audio difficulties in that way. If you do have questions, we are encouraging you all to use the question box you'll see, and as you ask them, we will have Jared and his staff address them. Also, so to make sure that we are able to keep accurate rosters, because we are grant funded, we are going to ask if you are attending with other people in the room with you. We are going to ask that you please enter your district in the question box and the full name and title of those who are also attending with you. So if you can start doing that as we're progressing, that'll greatly assist us in making sure that we can keep an accurate roster. So we'll have Jared take over in a little bit. So Onalaska High School, they are at full implementation of a culturally responsive multi-level system support. As many of you know from Doug Reed's research, when a school is at full implementation, that is when you start to see the dramatic increases in student achievement. So Onalaska High School is certainly demonstrating this. Their school report card identifies them as a school that significantly exceeds expectations, and Dr. Tony Evers just nominated Onalaska High School as a Blue Ribbon School. And so I will be turning this over to Jared.
Hello, I'm Jared Shaffner, the principal at Onalaska High School. I have been at Onalaska for the last 7 school years. I started out as an associate principal for 3 years, and then the principal since 2011-12 school year. Prior to that, I had a great experience teaching in Pulaski, Wisconsin, located just outside of Green Bay. Dan shared just a little bit as we started today, but just to give you a sense of who we are at Onalaska High School. As of this morning, we had 874 students. You can see our student demographic information. And one thing that I think is really important to note is that since 2008-09 school year, we've been a professional learning community school district. I sometimes wonder how a school district could implement RTI without the structure of a professional learning community network in place. And we were so fortunate that as an entire district, we're small enough that we can have all of our staff come for the back-to-school meeting. But at that August in-service day, our superintendent at the time shared that we were starting on a journey to becoming a professional learning community school district, not a school, but a school district, from the board all the way down through the classrooms. and that literally the next day everyone was expected to be in front of the high school at 7:30 to get on the school buses to go to the neighboring lacrosse center to hear a speaker that was speaking to several school districts about professional learning communities. And his powerful words that day were literally, tomorrow morning the buses are leaving at 7:30. And you need to get on the bus for this, because if you're not going to get on the bus for professional learning community journey, then you can't be part of this district anymore. That's how strong the administration team feels about the power the professional learning communities can bring to our school district. So we have certainly worked hard on that over the last 7 years, and just like RTI, our professional learning communities aren't where we want them to be, but we're a constant work in progress with that. One other interesting point is that we are only 13 square miles. We're a very small school district geographically, and because of that, we can do some things with interventions that in my former school district in Pulaski would have been very difficult due to busing concerns. One other key thing that I want to share with you before we start, because it impacts what we do from an early warning system standpoint, from a TAP standpoint, and also from the standpoint of response to intervention, is our school vision. And our school vision, our school board has set a goal that we have 80% of students take the ACT. That was prior to the change in state assessments, but 80% take the ACT with a composite score of 25. And we feel very strongly about that for several reasons. And the first thing I want to share that's not a reason is that we don't believe every student should go to a four-year college by any means. We're very fortunate in Onalaska that we have an outstanding technical college literally 10 minutes from our doors. But what we do want to have happen is that when a student leaves here, for them to have all four doors open to them. So if a student wants to go to a four-year university, that door is open because of their academic achievement. If they want to go to a two-year program, that door is open to them, and they're not going to be stuck taking several years of remediation first. If they want to go into the world of work, they're prepared for it. If they want to go into the military or an apprenticeship program, they're going to test at a higher level going into those programs. That's why we feel so important about working toward that vision of taking it to 25. We also know, and this is something that we talk about at staff meetings throughout the year as part of a spiral, is that when we achieve a 25 composite, we know that we'll have our universal curriculum aligned with best practice through our professional learning communities. We know that we'll have a system of interventions that identify students requiring more assistance immediately. That's a key thing that we've been focusing on, is not a system of interventions per se, but how fast we can identify those students. And also having our collaborative teams focusing on data, and simply put, all the research shows that when teams focus on data from formative assessments, it has the single biggest impact on student achievement. So that's who we are, and I share that with you because it very much impacts what we wanted to do with an early warning system. When we think about the challenges at the secondary level, I think the challenges that we've identified over the last 7 years are probably similar or the same as what your teams have identified. But the main ones that I would share, we're constantly looking at how do you balance out a student's desire to explore career opportunities. So we want that student taking that course in career and technical education. But at the same time, how do you work on the reading and math skill development? Because no matter how much literacy we infuse into that career and tech ed course, for a student that's low in reading, it still probably isn't enough to give them the support they need. We have students, like many of you, that are low in several different areas, and where do you focus on the most? When we first started out with the intervention period, I think this was our biggest problem that we weren't addressing at the time, is that some of our students were so low in so many areas that we were just giving them a minute amount of support and never making significant gains. We know that we need a really strong system to manage our data and to manage our interventions. And we also know, and I think this part's unique to the high school level, we have to focus on skill deficiency because, for kids to be career college ready, they need to have those strong skills in reading and math achievement and problem solving. But at the same time, we need to make sure they're getting enough credits to graduate so that they're not going to be at risk of not graduating from high school. And that certainly plays into effect when we're looking at the requirements for graduation.
And Jared, if I could just interrupt you for a second. We do have a question from Theodore Kreider. So Theodore, I will unmute you now so you can ask your question.
But well, I had a question, but you already answered it, so it's not a big deal.
Okay.
You're doing awesome. Thank you very much for letting me here tonight.
All right.
Absolutely. The other thing I wanted to just share at the bottom, one of my main professors in my master's program used to share that a challenge at the high school level is that high school staffs are often independent contractors that share a common parking lot, and that was certainly something that when we started out 7 years ago with PLCs and with RTI, it was a huge challenge to start getting everyone to come together and essentially eat from the same table and drink the same Kool-Aid. But we've made significant strides there, and it's caused a lot of stress for all involved through the process. But because of it, we've seen a steady increase in student achievement along the way. And I'm just having problems with advancing here. Dan, my computer's not, there we go, I'm sorry. So today's discussion, we're focusing on 3 things. 1, the use of the early warning system that we've developed at Onalaska High School. 2, how we use our TAPS team to drive our PLC work, and through that, to drive our RTI work. And 3, how we use both of these parts to develop interventions, and as importantly as developing them, evaluating the effectiveness of those interventions. You've all seen the Wisconsin vision for RTI, but this is exactly what we have finally, I think, found is along the way we've had parts of this together. We've tried focusing on collaboration. We've looked at the data that we're collecting, but I think we finally have moved to the point in the last year and a half where we're actually using all pieces together, and what we have found is using any of the parts in isolation doesn't come together for what we need it to do. And I would simply show this graphic before we start. We didn't have an early warning system for several years, which was a key missing part. Because we didn't have this, our TAPS group was not nearly as functional as it's become today. And because our TAPS group wasn't functional, what we were doing from an intervention standpoint wasn't working either. So all 3 of these pieces really need to be in place in order for our system at Onalaska High School to work. The first part I'll share with you is this, is that when we started in 2008, 2009, we started out with professional learning communities. We started out looking at the interventions we already had in place and looking at what we needed to work on more. One key thing in looking back at that is that we needed to focus more on universal instruction before we focused on Tier 2 and Tier 3. Because when we first started with some interventions, simply put, we were having way too many students qualify for Tier 2 and Tier 3. And what that did is over that course of that first year or two, it made us go back and start looking at what we could do from a universal standpoint to improve instruction. Because of that, it led to changes in our professional calendar in terms of early release days and some professional development days, full days scheduled throughout the year. It led to changes in our students' schedules in terms of the intervention time that's built into our students' time, in terms of building in other periods within the day to take advantage of the bell-to-bell time. It led to changes in the type of specialists we brought in to help our staff move forward, specifically in areas of discipline literacy, specifically in reading, and also then in math, using some local resources at the university level. And the other key thing is over the last 7 years, we've really looked at changing our school culture as we've looked at how we've gotten better with RTI and better with our professional learning communities. And overall, the biggest thing that we have come to do is that we've focused on our freshmen, knowing that if we can give them a solid first year in high school, we should spend a lot less time over the next 3 years dealing with the bad things that can happen during that first year of high school. In 2012 is where we really learned that despite the advances we were making with interventions and with our PLCs, we needed to develop something to use as an early warning system. And what happened is at our 2012 data retreat, our math representative said, let's use a Venn diagram, and let's look at students that are low socioeconomic, let's look at students that have failed one or more class, and let's look at students that are below grade level using the MAP assessment. We use the MAP assessment 3 times a year as a universal screener at the freshman, sophomore, and junior level. And our entire team was very humbled when we looked at this core group of students that were in all three groups. And when we looked at it, we were shocked how many students were in that group that we had not spent any time talking about at a problem-solving level over the course of that previous school year. We had talked about a lot of students that were failing classes. We talked some about students that were low socioeconomic, and we talked some about students that were in that below grade level. But man, those students that met all three of those criteria points, several of them we had never even addressed. And that's the point where we said we have to do something different to drive the work of our team. Here were the key things we needed to do. One, we needed to dispute what we know. One of my concerns when we have our mini data retreats throughout the year is when someone on the team, and I've been guilty of this myself, will say something like, well, we all know that the students that are low in this are also low in this or have this other risk factor. And when we started to do some data digs, we started to find out that what we all knew wasn't accurate, yet we were making a lot of major decisions based on that. So we needed to use that. We also needed to know if our interventions were being successful, and we needed to know how we needed to change that. And then the last part, we had so much data, whether it was demographic data, whether it was subjective data, or whether it was assessment data, we needed a way to manage all of that together. The process that we used is we started looking at other systems that were out there for high schools. What were the early warning systems that different national institutes had developed? And by looking at that, what we started to find out is we found features that we hadn't thought about that we certainly wanted to include in our early warning system. So some of the risk factors and some of the levels that were used to flag students within that risk factor, we learned a lot by looking at other systems. One concern that we had immediately is that most of them were focused on graduation versus our vision of taking it to 25. And certainly we want every student to graduate, but at the same time, we were dealing with a small enough population at risk of graduation that we were more focused on our vision, and we needed to have something that we could develop specifically for that. One other frustration I had as I started to use the early warning systems that I found, and there were several free ones available, is that they were incredibly hard to manipulate, or you could only use limited amounts of data. So for example, maybe there was only room for 10 risk factors, or 3 sets of data, or 2 pieces of demographic information. And as our team talked about it, and as we thought about it more, there were a lot of different things they wanted to include, yet we were quickly finding that we were maxing out that early warning system that we had found, the template, and then we had nothing else we could use. And we certainly did not want to have 3 or 4 different early warning systems because they weren't going to talk to each other. So we wanted something that would include all of it. And then the last part, and this was probably my concern more so than the rest of the team, we wanted to own it. We wanted to have complete control over it. We didn't want to worry about it being part of a system where a server somewhere in another part of the state goes down and we lose our information. We didn't want to have it be a case where we couldn't control every single part of it. And maybe that's the control mindset of a building principal, but that was a key thing that we wanted to have, was the ability to own the system. And the last thing that we really wanted is one of our teams, our math team, it's incredibly high functioning, a great group of teachers, but they're also really good at asking questions. So when I drop into their PLC, because they've requested data, they want to know how students are doing from a certain demographic group, I can come in with that data, but then the problem comes for me is that group is so good at asking questions that as soon as I start, they will instantly say, well, wait a minute, have you thought about this additional factor? And what I wanted to have is I wanted something where I could immediately open up my laptop, say, just give me a minute, and then say, okay, well, when we include that additional factor in, here's what we're looking at. So because of my math team's ability to ask questions, I also wanted something that could quickly pull out the information that they wanted. With frustrations found in terms of what I couldn't find, what we actually started doing is, just from experience using Microsoft Excel, we just started building our early warning system. And the advantages of using Microsoft Excel is that you can very quickly upload a lot of data at one time. I'll show you a demonstration from an abbreviated form of our early warning system. And the key thing is this. if I was going to be looking at, we have about 220 students per grade level. So at the end of winter map testing, we've got 6 different data sets to upload, 3 for math, 3 for reading at freshman, sophomore, junior grade levels. 220 scores times 6. I knew that A, there was a lot of room for error if someone was going to manually enter that many scores, and B, I also knew it was probably going to be me that had to enter the scores. And I didn't have the time for that, and I also know how quickly I can screw up numbers as I'm typing. So I wanted something that would quickly upload data. I wanted something that would store a lot of data at one time. And the other key thing I have found with Excel is that it very, very quickly allows you to make changes in terms of conditional formatting, hiding cells, columns, etc. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a minute. One problem that I found with Microsoft Excel is that we were able to pull a lot of data together and really look at a lot of things at one time. But then when it came time for informing our decision making about interventions, Microsoft Excel did not lend itself well to, for example, we have a class called eMath. It's a math intervention for students in all of our math classes. It's essentially an extended math course in which we do a lot of pre-filling, backloading, specific help on DOK 2 and 3 problems, really giving kids extra time for it. But one of the problems was if I wanted to pull out from our early warning system using just Excel to see how our eMath kids were doing in terms of map growth or star growth, there was no easy way to do that. And again, I needed an easy, simple, fast way to do that. One night in having a conversation with our technology director about this, his conversation to me was, Jared, I think you're trying to make Excel do something that a database does. Why don't you try using Microsoft Access? And by quickly learning how to use Access, we quickly found that we could view specific students with specific data, and by doing that, we could refute what we, quote, all know that sometimes wasn't accurate. One key thing to mention before I go to the demonstration, I had quite a bit of experience in Microsoft Excel from college 15 years ago. However, I had no experience with Microsoft Access. What I did find, though, that if you know the right question to ask, and if you Google that question, you will quickly get YouTube videos showing you how to do a drop-down menu in Excel, conditional formatting, a VLOOKUP, which I'll show you how to do. And likewise in Access, you can quickly get the information that you need. The Microsoft Access database links directly to our Excel spreadsheet. So if I make changes in our Excel spreadsheet and go to Access, the changes are immediate and quickly pull up for us. I'm going to demonstrate to you how we use it by pulling up a sample spreadsheet and then a sample database. Please ask questions as we go through this. And I'll share with you that some of the formulas I'll show you may look complicated, but again, after using them a few times, they're very quick in terms of using. This is a sample first of what our early warning system looked like in the first year. Notice I've deleted any names for identification purposes. But one key thing that we found is that we use our ID numbers for everything. And the reason for that is for the data upload. When we were looking at the sample EWS systems, none of them were reliant on names. And simply put, names are complicated because of last names and first names. Names are complicated because you have 3 Olsons or 4 Johnsons, or Johnson spelled with O-N versus E-N at the end, whereas the number is always consistent. So we include names. I've deleted them out of here for today, but you can see that we always use the ID number, and then after that, it was all of the data that we wanted to store in Microsoft Excel. So you can see, for example, is a student in a program? Is a student free or reduced from a socioeconomic standpoint? Is a student someone that our middle school communicated to us about at the end of their 8th grade year? One risk factor that we found to be an excellent prediction of high school struggle, did the student have any D's or F's at the middle school during the 2nd semester, specifically 4th quarter of 8th grade year? And you can look all the way across the top at what we've used. Were they dismissed from a program in the past? One key thing that we found is a student a new student to our school district? Some new students come in and do exceptionally well. Other students may have done well in the past, and that transition, they struggle significantly. When we were talking to a mentor at the UW La Crosse level, someone who works with school psychologists, he had mentioned to us this is a new risk factor that the university used. Any new transfer student after the freshman year, they closely follow. We started doing the same thing. But you can see going across the top the different types of data that we've collected on different students. At different points, we have also gone in and deleted columns after we've used them. One nice thing that I always do is whenever possible, if there's choices, we use a drop-down menu. And the reason for this is we want it to look exactly the same for each kid. So when I say exactly the same, the eMath looks the same for both of these students. That's incredibly important when I show you the Microsoft Access connection to this later on. Again, I didn't know how to use a drop-down menu, but if you Google how to use Microsoft Excel, how to create a drop-down menu in Excel, you get a great YouTube video on doing it. But information across the board. The other nice thing is that as a team level, if you're looking at something, and if we want to hide some information, you simply highlight the columns and click on hide, and it disappears. This makes it better to make it cleaner when we're uploading information later on. One key thing I should mention, you'll see socioeconomic status here. A lot of our teams will request specific information on specific groups of students, and we will give that to them in most cases. However, the only group that has access to the socioeconomic status would be our TAPS team, our team approach to problem solving at the most confidential level of our data retreats. So the teacher level teams cannot get this information. And then again, when I want to see information again, I simply unhide it. Works out great. You'll notice that we have gone through and flagged students. So for example, you'll see a student here with a score of 15 that's been flagged. The nice thing again about Excel is that I can simply select a column. So for example, the MAP scores in reading from last spring, I'm going to highlight. I'm going to go to conditional formatting. I'm going to say highlight everything that's less than. And we normally look at 40th from a standpoint of being at grade level in MAP. I'm going to click OK, and we'll go through and flag those different students for us throughout the program. The quick upload of information. I'm going to jump to a different spreadsheet. So what I want to show you, I'm going to hide several cells here so they're out of the way. So what I did earlier, we use PowerSchool for our data management program, and it's very quick to say, for example, run a list of all juniors with their student ID number and their disability status, or run a list of all students with what their math class is. So you can see algebra, math 1, or where it's NA, it's going to be geometry or algebra 2, but you can see that information. It's very quick to do that, and what we then do is we delete the columns we don't need. So for example, the student name will always pull in, and I simply delete that column. But on all of my subsequent worksheets that you can see, there's all sorts of different information, whether it's assessment or otherwise, with a student ID number. And then, for example, in this case, here's the scale score from the Aspire test that the freshmen took this fall in math. Here's the reading going across the board here. But I paste the information in. So one thing I couldn't show you is that I went in today, earlier, to the MAP website, and I simply pulled in all of our freshman reading math or reading scores for winter. So you can see that this student scored in the 41st percentile in reading MAP. I deleted the other columns, and that's all that's left. So all of the other pages, sheets in this case, 10, whatever, are the dirty pages. But I'm going to go back to the reading, and there's something called VLOOKUP. So I'm going to type in equals VLOOKUP. I'm going to tell the Excel to look for this ID number. So I'm going to put a parenthesis, and then I'm going to click on it. I'm going to put a comma there, and then I'm going to go back to my data set that I'm specifically looking for. So in this case, the sample data I pulled out earlier. I'm going to highlight this entire array of information. So I'm going to highlight all 200 and, in this case, 188 scores. I'm going to put a comma, I'm going to put a 2 because there's 2 columns. I'm going to put a 0 at the end to tell it to stop reading. And then the only other thing I have to do is I want it to look for all values. And this is the only tedious part. I'm going to put a $sign in front of the cell that starts the array and ends the array. So notice there's 4 $signs. And then all I do is hit enter on my keyboard. What you'll notice is it pulls up an NA. That's because that student didn't test this winter. But I'm going to copy the formula, paste it down, and you'll see that by doing that, it uploaded all the scores for the students. Now, for example, this student right here, student 500-2648, did not test for some reason this winter. The student might have been concussed. For whatever reason, it was a student that we missed, so that student is not in the system. But notice instead of giving it the score for the student below it, it simply skips right over the top of that student. When I populate, for example, this fall, when I started with my class of 2018, and when I went back and put in all of their MAP scores for last year, their student demographic data, I think it was 13 or 14 columns that I populated. It took me about 20 to 25 minutes to do that, to enter all of that information times 220 students. So that VLOOKUP feature, incredibly simple to quickly transfer data from one sheet to another without someone having to hand enter the data. Are there any questions on the use of the Excel portion of our early warning system?
And at this point, if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand. So.
Okay, I'm going to jump into the access portion. I'm going to close this. So Microsoft Access.
Jared, if you can hold on. Jared, we do have a question from Julie Montgomery. So Julie, you're unmuted.
Hey, can you move data from one workbook to another? I can see that you're doing it from one sheet to another.
From one workbook to another? Yes.
Through the VLOOKUP, I guess, is what I'm asking.
No. No. I've tried that. And the answer when I say no, either no, if I remember correctly, it doesn't work, or the other part might be no, it was much more complicated doing that. Because one thing to keep in mind is, for example, if I come in and delete this page out of my workbook, then my sheet 1 will go blank NA value for all of those columns.
Right. Okay, but I think I just created in my head a workaround for it. All right, well, thank you so much. That's helpful to know.
One change, incidentally, that we're making this spring is that right now we have a different Excel spreadsheet or workbook for each of our 4 respective classes. We're going to combine that all into one for next year and then just simply include grade level instead. The reason for that is because of students that you have freshmen and sophomores, for example, in some cases in the same intervention, and it's going to be faster to use that. But I'm going to jump to my Access database. If you haven't used Access, it's fairly quick to learn. Again, use the free tutorials. But I'm going to click on Create. I'm going to click on Query Design. And my Sheet 1 is the database, or this Excel workbook that you just saw. I'm going to click Add, and then I'm going to click Close. So for example, I'm going to pull an ID number. And one example of a question that sometimes gets asked, I'm going to take our students' socioeconomic status, and under criteria, I'm going to put in equals F. In other words, equals students that are on free lunch from this particular group of students. And let's say that we're questioning where students fall that are low socioeconomic status. You can probably guess now it's going to be across the board, but we'll do it anyway. So I'm going to pull in their reading scores in MAP from fall. I'm going to pull in we want to look at growth, so I'm going to pull in their reading winter MAP scores. The only students it's going to pull from our database now are the students that are free lunch. I'm going to go up above and click Run, and it's going to pull all those students out, and it's going to just have the information that we want. So we just pulled out the specific students that we want for the specific information that we want. This is where I always kind of talk with our TAPS team. The Excel spreadsheet is the big, messy piece. The Access makes the information clean for us, because now I wouldn't give the socioeconomic status to teams, but I could give the team the specific information they wanted. Another example, and again, you're just going to keep clicking Query Design. A question that the math team had is we want to look at students that are in a specific intervention. So I'm going to go to where, again, I have the eMath. It's a math intervention class. And we have students that are in different eMath classes, but I'm going to just look at students that are in the Algebra 1 eMath. And then I'm also going to go back and look at what was their math map score from fall. I'm going to drag it in. And what was their math map score from winter, and drag it in. I'm not setting any criteria limits here because, again, I want to see all those students. I think there's 23 of them. Where were their scores in fall? Where were their scores in winter after being in this intervention for that period? I'm going to click Run. And I'm going to pull up, those specific 19 kids. Maybe to make it easier, I'm going to sort the smallest to largest, and then look at what growth, if any, of those students experienced from fall to winter with this intervention. Questions on how the Access portion works along with the Excel version? Okay, if not, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. One key thing I want to emphasize at the end, we started out, once we built this, we didn't always know the best ways to use it, but one thing that, last week at the Wisconsin RTI conference, one of the keynote speakers asked the question, what achievement gap bothers you the most? And obviously a powerful question, but we wouldn't really have a way to answer all of our achievement gaps if we didn't have a tool like the early warning system to use to answer the question to start with. So before we even can answer the question, we have to know our achievement gaps that exist. The EWS gives us that opportunity. I'm seeing a question to answer that if you alter the data from the workbook, it'll mess up the one you pulled it into. And that is, it's correct with the VLOOKUP, is that if you change your original data set, it will change your early warning system tool. And we did find that out. We found out a more complicated workaround, but I'm seeing that the person has suggested it might have come up with something better than we came up with. Another question is that to get information from Excel into Access, to utilize the queries, do you simply import the entire Excel workbook? The answer is that we don't import it, we link it directly to it. When you set up your Access database, there's a couple different things you can do, but when you click on external data, if you go to Excel, there's a couple different options that you have. You can import it. So for example, if you have data that's not going to change because of what you're going to be using it for, that certainly is a easy way to do it. What we always do is we link it directly to the Excel document that we're using. So since we're using our EWS system multiple times a week, throughout the entire school year, we want all the changes in Excel to show up in Access. So we simply click on Link It, and then you simply go through and you attach it to the one that you want to attach it to by using the Browse feature. Question, how do you go about determining the flags for the early warning system? What we started off with is using some of our district norms. So for example, when we use MAP, get back to having our data. When we use MAP, 40th percentile is something that we specifically use. That's why we use that one. Otherwise, in the demographic data, it was something we talked about at our TAPS level, and we just simply said, what would be an appropriate risk level in this area? So for example, if you are a new student to our district, you're automatically going to get flagged. So this one should be flagged right now. If you're someone who was dismissed from a program in the past, you were originally in special education, you were dismissed, you're automatically going to get flagged. Does that mean that we're going to do anything with that student? Not necessarily, but we're certainly going to monitor how that student is doing. Likewise, with any of these other areas, it gives us the right group of students to be looking at through different times. One question that was asked is, why do you include the attendance from the first 30 days? This is where that initial research and looking for early warning systems that were put out by different groups, like the National Improvement for High School Centers, one of the key things they talked about is, if you look at your freshman class and look at the number of periods or days they missed in the first 20 days of high school as a freshman, it's an excellent risk factor for the next 3 years of high school. Our TAPS team was very skeptical about that when I shared it with them. However, we have found that it's an excellent group of students to monitor. You know, in some cases, it's that student that got mono the first week of school and missed 5 days. Okay, that's fine. But in other cases, it's that kid who was, you know, sick the first Friday, came back, was sick the next Wednesday, you know, sick the following Tuesday. We're starting to find out those are students that we definitely want to follow. Likewise, we also found locally any freshman who was going to skip a class in the first 30 days of school, the first month, was going to be a student that we wanted to know about immediately and follow. Our truancy level is certainly not where we want it to be. It certainly has gotten better, though, by following students through a system. But any student that was going to skip that first month when they were still adjusting to high school was a student that we wanted to follow closely. I think that answers the questions that were put out. One other thing I would share with you that was asked last week at the convention, you know, does every member of our TAPS team have access to this database? The answer is no. Our administration, we have one associate principal and then one associate principal / activities director. The 3 of us have access, and we immediately run reports for anyone that wants the information. Or at our TAPS level, we often run it every week for that group. The reason for that is the concern that I think our TAPS team had, as well as I had, is we didn't want anyone to inadvertently do something that would change our data, throw off our data, or essentially, you know, mess things up. There's enough times when I'm closing the database, when I get the do you want to save changes, when I've questioned if I've really made changes, that I worry about it, that we didn't want that happening with anyone else inadvertently. We'll jump
Jared,
back.
there was another question. Before you developed your system, or since you've developed it, have you utilized DPI's dues report?
Yeah, we did look at the dues numbers, and we did incorporate them into the full-fledged model that we have. For today's purpose, because of deleting names and not wanting to make any permanent changes that I couldn't undo, I showed you an abbreviated version of 2 different spreadsheets, but we did incorporate the dues numbers also. The one thing that we found is that by including a lot of this different information, we were able to really break the dues number. Our at-risk teacher, our English language teacher, our school psychologist, and whenever possible, our school resource officer joins our team meeting. This group meets weekly on Thursdays for approximately an hour and 20 minutes, and we hold this meeting very sacred in the sense that regardless of any other schedule changes we have or other commitments that team members have, we really expect the whole team to meet every week, and we really expect to meet every week. So if for some reason there's a snow day on a Thursday, we will always move that meeting to Friday instead, and all of us will make adjustments in our schedules to make the meeting work. Our TAPS team has come a long ways over the last 7 years that we've been focusing on it. And what I would, excuse me, my phone is ringing. What we looked at is we really started out 7 years ago admiring problems. I'll use a fictitious name, Sally. There was a student, Sally, that I think every week at our TAPS team we went through and really admired the problems that Sally brought to our school and to her learning. We talked a lot about the problems that she was facing outside of school, and we really admired her every single week, and nothing really changed as a result of that admiring. From that period, we said we really need to get better at turning our discussion into action. So we really started looking at, A, how are we going to track students, and B, what were we going to do for that student? So we came up with something at the time called a 5-minute list and a more than 5-minute list. And the whole focus was that the first half hour, we would focus on students, that we could identify the problem, discuss the student, discuss the intervention we were going to try, identify who was going to follow up with the student, and have the entire thing be over within 5 minutes for that specific student. And then we had a group called the more than 5-minute list. Really original, but the whole idea was it was more complicated, that 5 minutes was not going to be adequate. We needed more time for that student. That worked a lot better, but the problems that we found was this. There was complete randomness in selecting students that we were going to talk about, because one counselor might identify a student that we needed to discuss today. The other two counselors might have a student that looked just like that student that they didn't feel as urgent to talk about, even though they were probably at the same level. So our system was entirely dependent on adults to identify it versus having a system to identify it. Again, that's where our early warning system comes in. Not having adults identify the students, but having adults start to fix the problems when we identify the students to talk about. And then the other problem is, it just felt like gossip far too often. We felt like, I really felt like, man, we're starting to talk about some students in much greater detail than we need to. So what happened is, with help from the RTI Center, about 14 months ago, we changed our TAPS approach entirely. And what we started to do is, we started to use fidelity in using our system to identify the students, and then use the adults to solve the problem, versus having adults identify the students, a major change. And we also looked at, we are not celebrating nearly enough, and we need to focus on celebrating. I think we have an incredibly positive staff at Onalaska High School. I think we have a very positive TAPS team. But when we started out this change about 14 months ago and said, at the beginning of every TAPS team, everyone has 30 seconds or less to identify a celebration related to student achievement and celebrate with the rest of the TAPS team. And we said, you know what? We'd like the celebration to be about a system, about a group of students, but by all means, we can celebrate that individual student also. A huge challenge that we initially faced was that we wanted to celebrate by saying that, wow, the students in our eMath group are making great growth in MAP, but, and we would throw that but in and say, but they're still so far behind. Or that, wow, the student that was a major truancy issue 2 months ago, with some interventions in place, the student is doing much better with attendance, but they're still not doing their homework. So we had a focus for about a month on creating new norms about celebrating, to get to the point where we could genuinely celebrate without saying, knock on wood, without saying, but this is still happening in this other part. And then also looking at, again, how are we going to use a system to identify students? So for example, with attendance, instead of having our associate principal come in and say, well, here are some kids I'm concerned about because I'm constantly talking to them about attendance, let's use our early warning system. Let's run all truant periods for all students in the high school, and let's look at every student then that has more than X number of truant periods over the designated time period. We specifically found with excused absence that when we put those names up on the wall, that some people would say, for example, our school nurse might say, well, so-and-so has a lot of excused absences, but it's entirely related to a major illness. Great, let's cross them off the list. Let's cross this student off the list because of a major health condition. Whatever it is, let's start crossing these students off because of a vacation they took or something else. Now let's just talk about the students that are left that are major concerns, for example, for excused attendance. What we found if we didn't do this is that we were missing large numbers of students that we needed to be talking about. By focusing on freshmen and by improving our process with our TAPS team, we started to find that one thing that we always track is a number of students at every grade level passing every class at that grade level. And what we found with our freshmen over the last 7 years, as you can see, we started out with 75% of our freshmen passing every class for first quarter. Most recently, year 8's not on here, we'd be at 92.5% passing. But one thing that we talk about sometimes with our TAPS team is what we see right here. If you read Michael Fullen, he will talk about implementation dip. We very much had an implementation dip the first year that we really tried to work on interventions and improving our TAPS process. The key thing that we talk about as a reminder to ourselves at times, you know, if we're doing the right work and if we're using data to drive instruction and make adjustments, we can expect at times we're going to see this implementation dip before we start to see the steady growth getting to the levels that we want to be at. A new portion, I think, of TAPS that we've really tried to focus on by focusing on groups of kids is that we really want to brainstorm without the constraints of logistics. Come up with that look. Where do we do it? How do we do it? Where are we going to pull these kids out of? And what we have found we need to do is not worry about logistics when we're trying to identify the needed solution for students. So for example, this last spring, a year ago, we had a local counseling agency come to us. They had just received a grant to work up to 40 hours a week with high school students that were at risk. They came to us and they said, we'd like to work with some of your students. How can we do it? So this came to our TAPS team, and we certainly have at-risk kids, and we certainly would love a free resource like this coming in to work with students. The problem that we've known from the past is if we have a counselor, if we have a group session, if we have anything like that, if we have it after the school day for at-risk students, we might be able to convince 10 that they should come to the meeting after school in my conference room, for example. And then that first day shows up, and of the 10, 3 of them show up. And then the second week, 1 of them comes back, and 3 weeks later, there's no student left, and the group ceases to exist. We didn't want that to happen. So we started saying, how could we somehow work this into the school day and make this successful for students? And through the process, without worrying about logistics, we started to throw out different ideas. And after about 15 minutes, we came up with, why couldn't we include this within a lifetime activities FIED course? All of our students need FIED, just like your students do. So we have a captive group. Why couldn't we select a targeted group, put them with a targeted FIED teacher, and then on the 1 day a week when class is 85 minutes long, why couldn't we have the counselor come in that day and work with small groups of students? So maybe the counselor could work with half the class while the PE teacher has the other half, and then they could flip-flop. They could do a lot of different things. And we were able to put that intervention together with the help of the counseling agency, with the help of our FIED department, and it was a great success for first quarter. Of the students in that group, it was a group that failed a lot of classes the previous year, or 2 years in some cases. First semester, with the exception of 1 student, all of them passed every class for first semester. They developed an outstanding relationship with this FIED teacher, and even though they started out very guarded with the counselor that was coming in, at the end of the semester, through surveys, they said they really valued that Thursday every week when they got to work specifically with the counselor on the specific issues facing those students. They also asked if they could continue in the course for second semester. The answer was no. We're going to try a different group of students. We continue to monitor that group, though, through our early warning system. The key thing that we have found with TAPS when we work with groups of students is that our TAP groups owns the vision of the school, and then we communicate to our PLC groups the areas of concern that we need to work with that we identify through our early warning system. So for example, when we were using our early warning system earlier this school year, we were seeing students that were really struggling in English 10. Why were they struggling? They were struggling with the narrative essay that they all had to write about, I don't remember the specifics, but the narrative essay. And they needed more time and support on it. The mistake our team first made is that even though we identified the problem, we identified the time we could work with those students, the problem was our TAPS team said, well, who on this team could then help those students during that time? We did that the next week. It involved using me, the associate principal, and 2 of the counselors. But then we had that major aha moment when we said, why aren't we using the English 10 team during this intervention time to work with the students on the specific area of need that they have? And after that, that's what we've shifted to is we'll do the work of setting up the time and the location and getting the students there, and then we'll use the specialists, in this case the English 10 team, to work through helping those students with those specific issues that they have. It's made our TAPS team more successful, and it's probably done a better job also of helping our other teams learn the value of the communication with the TAPS team. Are there any questions on the TAPS process or the team? The key things I can't emphasize enough: identify the ways that we're going to celebrate student achievement and staff success, and also using that early warning system to identify groups of students, because you could spend 15 minutes talking about that one kid that's not getting English 10 work done, or you could spend 15 minutes talking about the 20 kids and then have 20 kids be successful versus one. If not, moving into the interventions. Again, the key thing that we learned 7 years ago, you have to start with improving Tier 1 and constantly focus on improving Tier 1 universal instruction. 2 years ago, our U.S. history PLC was very frustrated because students were performing so poorly on their vocab quizzes in U.S. history, and we were talking about how we were using our intervention period to help those students. And then again, one of the U.S. history teachers said, could we get the literacy specialists from CISA 4 to work with our team? Well, of course, that's something we should have thought of a long time ago. So we looked at how we are teaching vocabulary. We used our literacy specialist that we contract for through our local CISA agency, and suddenly, instead of students getting 5 out of 12, 6 out of 12 on vocab quizzes, now we're consistently having students score 10, 11, 12 out of 12 on their vocab quizzes. So again, focusing on Tier 1 versus Tier 2. And then the other key thing is, if you haven't looked at Mike Matos, the work that he's done with interventions, he's through Learning Tree. He does phenomenal work, and he's really helped us through attending some of his workshops at PLC institutes learn how we have to ask the questions of the interventions that we have. Through his work, here's what we use for our intervention grid to evaluate the effectiveness of interventions. We have a column where we have the intervention name. The next column is research-based. And for each of these next 5 columns, we use either a plus, a 0, or a minus. The plus means absolutely 100% confidence. The 0 means there's confidence, but not at the same level as above. And the negative means, simply put, it's not happening. So when we're looking at research-based, we're asking ourselves, is this something that either there's research to suggest it works, or do we have local evidence to suggest that it works? Right now, I would say we're more heavily focused on the use of local evidence to support an intervention being successful or not. We ask I might say we started out administratively asking these questions, and then we moved to our TAPS team to ask these questions, and then the last level of refinement was going to our individual PLCs to ask these questions, and then it's a constant process of looking at. So then we look at it as a directive. In other words, is it a choice for the student to be in the intervention, or is it something that we can tell them you have to be in the intervention? One thing that I've been fairly strict about at the administrative level is, if we don't have evidence to show that this is successful, it's really hard for me to tell a student you have to be in this intervention. Because when a student says, well, will it help me? If my answer is, I hope so, that's not enough for me to tell the student that they can't take the elective that they want or the other course that they want. So we really make sure that if we're being directive with it, we've got evidence to show that it's successful. Is it timely in the sense that we get students into it as fast as we should? Are we using a highly trained person in the intervention? And is it systematic so that we can ensure that every student who should get the intervention is getting the intervention? I'm going to come back to highly trained in just a second. We identified what the criteria should be for the intervention. This is an awesome discussion to have with PLC teams and TAPS teams. Is it a will issue or a skill issue? And then how are we going to measure if this is going to be successful or not, this intervention? Looking at the criteria, looking at the measurement, those are awesome discussions to have once a semester with your PLC teams, because A, we have found it changes, and B, it continues to drive the work about why we're doing what we do with this intervention. A question that was just asked, how often do you do a review of the intervention grid? We do it once per semester at the TAPS level, and then once per semester at the individual PLC level as it relates to that intervention. So for example, the EMATH intervention that we use would obviously be named here. Do we have local evidence that shows that it's successful? Yes, because the first year that we used it, we invited students to join. It probably worked out well by chance that what we found out was about half the kids that we wanted to have in the class joined the class. So what we could do is we did a matched pair analysis of students that were in eMath versus students that were not in eMath. How successful were they in the course, and how successful were they in their map growth over the course of that school year? We use a matched pair analysis extensively when we can to look locally at how students are doing. Is it directive? eMath is directive now, because if you fall under the 40th percentile, you're going to be in that eMath class until you're out of the 40th percentile as measured by MAP on 2 consecutive MAP tests. So it's directive. Is it timely? Yes, because we move students as soon as we need to into that. Is it highly trained? We are calling it highly trained because we are using a math teacher that we've given professional development on use of differentiation. Is it systematic? Yes, because unless there is an administrative opt-out on it, which we've only used in 1 or 2 specific cases. So we have those periods, we have all of those factors in place as a plus for our eMath. We've been focusing on the same thing with reading, and we're almost to the point after we look at our spring data where we're speculating we're finally going to be at the spot where we're feeling like we have something in place that's working for high school students to improve reading skills. Incidentally, we're using Reading Plus with 2 reading teachers, and the growth so far over half the year has been very encouraging. Questions been asked, can you give examples of research-based or local evidence interventions you use? Absolutely. In fact, what might work best, I can send you our intervention grid. It's got 30, 35 things on it that will have everything on it, and then you can ask specific questions from there. One other thing that I'll mention is one thing that Mike Matos would tell you is that highly trained, it's going to depend on if it's a will issue or a skill issue. Mike Matos was a middle school principal for many years, and he gave the example that if you've got kids that aren't doing their homework and you're telling them that they have to come in at a specific time to do their homework, if they're not doing their homework just because they don't want to do their homework, you know, his comment was any principal should be, quote, highly trained to tell kids, I'm going to sit down with you and make you do your homework until it's done. And then he would also say that if they're not doing their homework because they don't understand the math, well, then maybe the principal isn't highly qualified. Maybe in that case you need to have a math person there instead to measure it. One key part of our response to intervention is that we have a privilege system. We went to Adlai Stevenson, and we made 2 trips there in 2007-08 and 2008-09, and we saw a lot of things there that we liked. But one thing that we saw that we really liked from a student management, behavior management system was a privilege-based program. We don't use PBIS, and I will be the first to tell you that I think we probably should. However, from a capacity standpoint, we're not there where I think we're ready to add that portion. And part of that is because of the success of our privilege program. But the way that our privilege program works is that if you're a junior or senior, you need at minimum 6 classes in your day out of an 8-period day. And the way that it works for students is that one of those periods that's open can be what's called the 340 period. This is based off of Wisconsin Act 340 that says a school can create a system that allows students in good standing, as defined locally, to have essentially a free period in the day where they are responsible for themselves. So for example, if I have a first hour 340, that means that I am passing all of my classes with a C- or higher. We do grade checks every 3 weeks for this. So C- or higher, no attendance issues, including tardiness, no behavioral issues, and my parents have agreed to it in a written form, then I can have a 340 period, which means instead of coming to school first hour, my day starts at second hour. Or I might have 8th hour 340, which means when 7th hour is over, I'm free to leave. I can still stay in the school if I want to, but no one is taking attendance on me, and I'm not responsible to be in any certain spot with it. The other thing that juniors, sophomores, juniors, and seniors can have is they can have what's called a commons period. This is essentially an honors study hall. I can listen to music, I can use my electronic device, I have a lot of freedom. It's in our commons, and it's staffed by one teacher as a supervision. Students love 340s. They like commons. They generally dislike the next level, which is a structured study hall. All of our freshmen, if they have an open period, will have a structured study hall. However, within a structured study hall, we have Tier 1 and Tier 2. If I'm on Tier 2 in study hall, that means that, again, I have a C- or higher. I'm not having attendance issues or behavior issues. That means I can sign out to go to the LMC. That means I can sign out to go to a teacher's classroom. It means I can work together with another student. I have more freedom within that structured study hall. If I'm on Tier 1, for example, I'm getting a D in a class or an F in a class, that means I have the freedom to learn, but not much else within that study hall. I'm not going to have a chance to use an electronic device. I'm not going to the library unless an administrator signs off on a pass to use a computer to work with other students. I just have the opportunity to learn during study hall. Incredibly effective if you have a senior who suddenly starts failing a class, they drop to a commons. Next grade check, they're still failing, they drop to Tier 1 in study hall. It provides intense motivation for that student to do what's needed to get their grades up, to work their way back up. What we always tell our students is, we manage down, you manage up. So the associate principal will call a student in to say, you just lost your 340 period. When that student feels they've earned it back, the student comes to Mrs. Curtis, our associate principal, and says, can I have my privileges back again? It took about 4 years before students started calling it privileges, but that's what we've called it, and it basically took a full high school cycle before our students now simply refer to it as, can I have my privileges back? The other really neat thing about this system, if a student is doing something that they shouldn't be doing in a classroom, it's so powerful to say to a student, you know what, you have a week to change your behavior. In that time, I'm going to take away your 340, and you're going to be in a commons instead. Or I'm going to take away your commons, you're going to a study hall for a week instead. Students quickly find out what they need to do to bring their grades back up, their behavior up, or their attendance up. We do have a modified block schedule, which is an important part of our process. We have 8 school periods on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays that are 47 minutes in length. And then on Wednesdays and Thursdays, we have 4 classes, 85 minutes each. We have odd hours on Wednesday, even hours on Thursday. We also, as part of that, have an intervention period at the end of the day that is 40 minutes in length. And during that time, every student, during that resource period, every student is assigned somewhere in the building. So, for example, again, we've created honors areas to get some students out of classrooms. The biggest concern I think my teachers had was, are we going to end up having 25 kids in the class and then expect to work, to help figure out those 25 students' needs? And the answer was no, we can't do that. So what we do is that juniors and seniors that, again, qualify can be in a commons at that time. We have sophomore honors areas, and we just created freshman honors areas for students that are doing well academically and behaviorally. For students that need support, we schedule them by area of greatest need. We have created a few enrichment groups, not as many as we want, but we do have some that meet. And then the other thing is, if you're a sophomore, junior, or senior, and you don't have an open period in your schedule, then at that time you can have a 340 or that open time at the end of the day instead. We have found that to make our resource period work most effectively, we need to make it as fluid as possible in terms of if something isn't working. For example, if I'm a physical science teacher and I have 2 kids that really need help in physical science, but they just can't handle being in the same room together, then my message is just tell me, and I'll move one of them to a different science teacher, still getting the same support that they need, but we're not making it a bad period for the teacher to try focusing exclusively on behaviors at that time. One piece I should mention as part of the resource period, because of the 340, and then I'm going to jump back to our privilege system. One of the questions that was asked is this a culturally responsive practice with our privilege program? And that was a great question. And we went back to our early warning system to look at, for example, is our 340, is that exclusively a certain type of student, or is that generally reflective of our entire student body? When we went back and looked at our 340 period, when that question was asked, here's what we found out. As of last week, Monday, 262 students had a 340 period. When we looked at, for example, students from low socioeconomic status versus those that were not, we found that we were very close percentage-wise. 340 were students on free and reduced lunch, where we're about 25% overall for our student body. We found that when we broke down by ethnicity, we were also very close to being that the students that from different ethnic groups very much paralleled our overall student body. The one area that we found, though, that our 340 period was not in any way, shape, or form culturally responsive was with students with disabilities. Last Monday when I ran the list, none of our students with a disability had a 340. Now, does that mean that all of our students with disabilities are failing at least one class or have a behavior problem, attendance problem, or tardiness problem? Absolutely not. But when we looked at that as a task team, because that was a great question then that our early warning system was able to, we do give more time to and support to our students with disabilities. So many of our students with disabilities, they certainly can qualify for any of these. However, they also qualify for more intensive small group support, focusing on reaching their IEP goals. At least none of our students in regular education can qualify for work release. Our district's philosophy has long been that we want students in school. We don't want them having any opportunities for work release, right or wrong. We do have students, though, with disabilities that, as part of their transition plan, do have work release. They might have a 340 during that period instead. And then the last thing we looked at is we strongly believe in the benefits of an AP curriculum. And in the last 3 years, we have pushed a lot more students into AP courses. As part of that, some students have needed more support. It's probably why some of our students that otherwise would qualify are instead getting extra support during that time. We've also added extra support classes. So, for example, several of our students that are in we have an extra chemistry course we added this year. We call it eChem for extra chemistry. It's an elective half-credit course taught by a chemistry teacher, and it very much focuses on breaking the biggest concepts down into smaller pieces. We're really excited about the growth those students have shown so far in chemistry. However, many of those students also have a disability. So, to look at it from the question about is it culturally responsive, it is in several areas, and it certainly is not with students with a disability. The last thing I'll share with you before taking other questions, I showed this diagram in the beginning. Let me give you one more example of how it works and how we use it to ask the questions we have to ask. We found out with our TAPS group about 3 years ago, we were talking about, man, we are so frustrated with some of our freshmen because they are not coming in doing homework. If they're not getting it done in class, they're However, it's really hurting their grade on the showing that not following that academic behavior of doing homework. So we started talking at our TAPS level team about what could we use to get students, freshmen, to do their homework. We said, what if we use lunch? As sophomores, juniors, and seniors, our freshmen don't have a lot of privileges that you can pull. Again, and during that discussion, we came up with something called lunch support. The way lunch support works is that we specifically scheduled our family and consumer ed teacher to have a prep during the consumer education room is available. So the way it works is in my core classes, in English, Math, Science, and Social Studies, if there's an assignment due, and if I don't turn it in, my respective teacher in that course simply goes to the Google Doc that's pulled up on the bottom of my toolbar on my computer, and I simply type in If I'm the teacher, I just type in Shaffner, my last name. I type in the student's name, Joe Green, and I type in algebra assignment 2.1, and that's all I do. And then at lunch, the associate principal largely, or me, we are in the commons, and as students come through the lunch line, in some cases, it's just a discreet look, and the student knows, yep, I'm going to lunch support. In other cases, it's just saying, George, remember, you're going to lunch support. And the student takes his or her lunch. They go to the Family and Consumer Education room. We have a lunch supervisor stationed there with a laptop with the Google Doc on it. And as soon as the student comes in, the lunch supervisor will say, George, you know what you got to work on? Yes. Or remember, you're going to work on 2.1 as soon as you're done eating lunch. And then the student goes through, eats lunch, and then works on the homework. When I say the early warning system, so we started doing this. We identified the problem at TAPS. We talked about this as an intervention development and evaluation. And then at a mini data retreat, we started talking about, do we have the right people staffing the lunch support? Because simply put, it was 2 people that we thought could handle it. The first year it started out being me because I was available. The associate principal would get the kids. I would help the kids. It worked well, but we found that my schedule too often had conflicts. So last year, in the second year of it, 13-14, we moved to having, instead of me doing it, we had a teacher that was on lunch supervision do it instead. And one of the questions that came up at our data retreat was, man, maybe that's not the right person to put in there to staff the lunch support, because I bet a lot of those kids are kids that they simply can't do the homework. It's too hard for them. I bet they're, a lot of them, they're not doing their physical science. I bet the math is just too hard for those kids. What an awesome opportunity to say, you know what? Let's pull up those kids quick in our early warning system, and let's look at, is this a skill issue or is this a will issue? Because it should impact who we have in the room at that time. And most of us speculated that these were kids that it was probably a skill issue. What we quickly found out instead is, wow, these are actually more of a will issue. These are kids who can do it. They just choose not to do it instead. So what we ended up doing is we pulled 3 of our regular lunch support kids out because we said these are really skill issues. We figured out something different for them instead and had them go back to regular lunch. But then the others, we said, we're going to keep doing this with you until you learn the importance of doing homework. We found out last year through our TAPS process, we thought, you know what? The great thing is, by the first month of school, by the end of September, we knew all of our at-risk freshmen in that first month of school. And when I say we, the associate principal, me, and our counselors, we immediately could put faces to names of kids that we were going to be talking about, as it turned out, for the rest of the school year. So we quickly learned a group we needed to identify. And the second thing that we found out from that process was we speculated that over the course of one semester last year, lunch support would work to change those students' behaviors. And so third quarter, we quit doing it. And automatically then our early warning system by the end of third quarter picked up the same group of students that were really starting to struggle academically now without lunch support. We picked out 25 kids at the end of fourth quarter. We divided them out among our TAPS team. We interviewed them. And one of the things they said is, it really worked better first semester when I knew I had to do my homework, because I hated going to lunch support. And then when I didn't have to go third quarter, I just quit doing it. And then I started to find out on tests I really didn't know what I was doing. So again, this whole process, all 3 of these pieces have to be in place together. If we didn't have our early warning system in place to manage data, we probably would have speculated that these kids were all skill issue kids, and we needed to somehow free up a science teacher, a math teacher, and an English teacher to work with these kids. Because of the early warning system, we knew it just had to be someone that could tell a kid, quit grumbling, get to work, let's get your homework done, I'll help you. The TAPS group developed it. Everything had to be part of that process for it to work. Question that's been asked, do you have protocol for your TAPS group that you use to look at with your data and to make decisions? Yes, I think I'm understanding the question. We do try to focus on specific things, specific weeks. So for example, right after mid-quarter, we're going to focus on academic achievement as measured by grades. Right after the winter map testing, we're going to focus on academic achievement as measured by a standardized test, the map. 2 weeks ago, we said we need to focus on celebrating with students. We started something about 4 years ago that was really neat. We call it a topper turnaround lunch, and the name is just what it implies. Celebrating with a student via food, via lunch, that's really turned himself around or turned herself around. And what we did is I bought lunch from Wendy's or Subway, and I said to the student, "You've made great progress. Tell me 2 teachers you want to invite that were pivotal in helping you turn yourself around, because we want to celebrate the role of those adults. Invite one or And then also, why can't we look at, these 6 sophomores, really, they made the similar type turnaround. Why can't we just have a bigger lunch, invite more people to it, and make this a bigger celebration? It allows us to do, 6 times the work in one group meeting versus 6 times doing it. I'll share with you, our students that we've done this with have loved the topper turnaround lunches, and maybe even more importantly, the staff that have done it have absolutely loved the turnaround lunches. To celebrate, and then one thing I do with the student in advance, I ask the student, you've invited Mrs. Koblitz. What's the reason you're going to share? And so we talk about it so the student knows, clearly how they want to the teacher, how that teacher has helped. It's just been a positive cultural change all around in working with students that have made major changes, through their academics, behaviors, or otherwise. Any questions that you have, we certainly can take at this time, but otherwise feel free to call or ask. We frequently look at other schools that are, doing things that we want to do. Are there any other questions at this time? Thank you. And again, if there's any questions that we can help with, by all means, please contact us. And we've found that we've learned as much from everyone we've talked to as they've probably learned from us.
Okay. Well, definitely. Thank you, Jared. I will be taking the screen back. So on the screen right now, for those of you that are still sitting in and listening, Jill Koenitzer, one of our colleagues at the RTI Center, she has created a Google Plus community. So Wisconsin RTI Center Secondary RTI Innovators. So that community, if you go to the link on the screen, that top one. It's just goo.gl and then capital E, capital W, lowercase q, 4, capital J, and a 3. That'll take you to that secondary community. So Jill does an excellent job about posting important events, and then as we do wrap up, we do want people to just complete a quick little 2-question survey based on your experience. Help us monitor webinars and do that in the future. So thank you all for your time, and if there are any last questions or comments, we'd be glad to take them.
Dan, it's Heidi. I just wanted to mention that we will be sending out a link to access the webinar recording,
Yep.
as well as my barking dog, as well as the materials that Jared is sending us.
Yep, so that should be coming hopefully later on this week, if not early next week. All right. So again, thank you, Jared.
Thank you, Dan, and again, if there's questions, please let us know.
All right, will do.